In the winter of the year 897, the people of Rome gathered inside a cold and crumbling basilica to witness something deeply strange. Not a coronation, not a funeral, not even an execution. A dead pope was about to stand trial. His corpse, dug from the grave after months underground, would be dressed again in papal robes and propped upright upon a throne, while another pope screamed accusations at it before a horrified crowd. And somehow, this was not even the strangest thing happening in Rome at the time. Tonight you walk through one of the most chaotic and grimy periods in medieval history, where power shifted by the week, holy men commanded armies, and the throne of St. Peter became the centre of a feud so bitter that even death failed to end it. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod. To understand why a pope would drag another pope from the grave, you first have to understand just how profoundly unstable Rome had become by the late 9th century. When you picture medieval Rome, you may imagine solemn priests moving quietly through candlelit corridors while choirs echo beneath vaulted ceilings. The reality was rather less dignified. The city was decaying. Ancient aqueducts lay broken. Whole districts had become patches of weeds and collapsed stone. Goats wandered among Roman ruins that had once housed senators and emperors. The population had shrunk dramatically from the glory days of the empire, and everywhere lingered the smell. Smoke from cooking fires, rotting refuse tossed into alleys, damp river mud from the Tiber flooding the streets, animals packed into cramped courtyards beside humans who possessed only a vague commitment to sanitation. The Rome of 897 was not the triumphant centre of Christendom people often imagine. It was a dangerous political battleground. The papacy itself had become entangled in aristocratic feuds so vicious that becoming pope was increasingly less a sacred calling and more an invitation to assassination. Noble families manipulated elections, emperors interfered constantly, bishops schemed against one another with the enthusiasm of exhausted raccoons fighting over stale bread. And in the centre of this chaos stood a man named Pope Formosus. Pope Formosus was not initially known as a villain. In fact, by most accounts, he was intelligent, capable, and highly respected. Before becoming pope, Formosus served as a bishop and diplomat. He travelled widely across Europe and gained a reputation for competence during an age when competence was surprisingly rare. This alone made him dangerous, because medieval politics rewarded loyalty far more than skill. Formosus became deeply involved in the power struggles surrounding the Holy Roman Empire, particularly the question of who should rule Italy and receive imperial blessing from the Pope. This conflict split Europe into rival factions. On one side stood the powerful Spolitan family of Italy. On the other stood Arnulf of Carinthia, a German king who sought control over the empire, and Formosus made a choice. He sided against the Spolitans. This would eventually prove catastrophic. Still, at first, things appeared successful. Formosus crowned Arnulf as emperor in Rome, but politics in medieval Europe had the structural stability of wet parchment. Arnulf soon fell ill and withdrew northward. The Spolitan faction regained power, and suddenly Formosus found himself surrounded by enemies. Then, in April of 896, he died, perhaps from illness, perhaps from stress. Medieval chroniclers are not especially reliable when it comes to medical diagnostics. To them, nearly every death involved either fever, divine punishment, or a disturbance of the humours. Formosus was buried with proper ceremony. That should have been the end of the story. It was not. After Formosus died, another pope briefly took the throne before dying himself after only a few weeks. This was not considered unusual. The average life expectancy of popes during this era resembled the shelf life of unrefrigerated milk. Eventually the papacy passed to Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was aligned with the Spoletan faction, the very people Formosus had opposed. And whether from political pressure, personal hatred, fear, or some spectacular mixture of all three, Stephen decided something extraordinary had to happen. Formosus would be tried for crimes against the Church. There remained only one slight complication. Formosus had been dead for about 9 months. For most people, this might have represented a practical obstacle. Stephen appears to have viewed it as a logistical detail. Imagine Rome in the dead of winter, the air damp and cold, fog drifting above narrow streets, the distant barking of dogs echoing through ruined stone corridors once walked by emperors. Somewhere outside the city, workers approached a grave. Inside lay the decomposing remains of Pope Formosus. and under orders from the reigning pope himself they dug him up. The corpse was exhumed, dressed once again in papal garments, and transported through Rome for trial. Even by medieval standards, people found this unsettling. The body was reportedly decayed badly enough that attendants had to prop it upright on a throne inside the basilica of St. John Lateran. You can picture the scene. Candlelight flickering against stone walls, thick incense struggling heroically against the unmistakable reality of human decomposition. Nervous clergy avoiding eye contact with the corpse. A deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the dead pope, which is, objectively speaking, one of the least desirable assignments in legal history. Imagine preparing for that conversation. Good morning. Your task today is to defend a partially decomposed body from accusations delivered by an enraged pope. One suspects the deacon briefly considered a career in farming instead. The trial became known as the Cadaver Synod, or, less formally, the Synodus Horrenda, the Horrible Synod, an admirably direct title, no medieval subtlety there whatsoever. Stephen VI presided over the proceedings with furious intensity. He accused Formosus of perjury, of illegally becoming Bishop of Rome, and of violating church law by holding multiple bishoprics. The corpse sat silently upon its throne, naturally. Meanwhile, the deacon attempted to answer for the dead man as best he could while surrounded by clergy who likely wished to be absolutely anywhere else. The atmosphere must have been unbearable, not merely grotesque, but tense, because everyone present understood the true purpose of the trial. This was not about theology, it was politics. Stephen and the Spolitan faction wanted to erase the legitimacy of Formosus entirely. If Formosus had been an unlawful pope, then his decisions, appointments, and political alliances could all be invalidated. The dead man threatened the living, so the living placed the dead on trial, and eventually, unsurprisingly, Formosus was declared guilty. What followed somehow became even more disturbing. The papal garments were stripped from Formosus's body. 3 fingers on his right hand, the fingers used for blessings, were cut off. His acts as pope were declared invalid. Ordinations he had performed were annulled, and then the corpse itself was dragged through the streets of Rome. One imagines the citizens watching this spectacle with a mixture of horror and exhausted resignation, because by this point, Rome had become accustomed to elite madness. When your ruling institutions routinely involve murder, excommunication, military invasions, and corpse mutilation, public cynicism begins to settle in rather heavily. Finally, the body of Formosus was thrown into the Tiber River, a fittingly bleak end, or so Stephen VI believed. But medieval people possessed a powerful appetite for signs and omens, and according to later accounts, strange stories soon began spreading through Rome. Some claimed the corpse washed ashore, others whispered of miracles. Still others insisted divine anger had fallen upon Stephen himself. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the fact that people believed them, and public opinion turned swiftly. The Cadaver Synod horrified many Romans. Even in an age familiar with brutality, this had crossed a line. There remained something profoundly unsettling about watching the Church desecrate its own dead leader in public. Soon political winds shifted once again. Stephen VI lost support rapidly, and in medieval Rome, losing support was often unhealthy in a very immediate sense. An uprising erupted. Stephen was imprisoned. Then, sometime in the summer of 897, only months after the trial, the Pope who had prosecuted a corpse met his own grim end. he was strangled to death in prison. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who had dragged a rival from the grave was now dead himself, abandoned by the same brutal political system he had tried to master. Rome moved on quickly. It always did. Another pope reversed the rulings against Formosus. His body was recovered and reburied with proper honours. The Cadaver Synod was condemned, then condemned less strongly, then partially reinstated, then reversed again. The papacy during this era resembled an institution governed entirely through panic and revenge. Policies changed depending on who currently possessed soldiers. The Cadaver Synod did not emerge from nowhere. It belonged to a broader period historians sometimes call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy. This was a time when the office of pope became heavily controlled by powerful Roman aristocratic families. Popes rose and fell with astonishing speed. Some were imprisoned, some murdered, some died mysteriously, some lasted only weeks. The papacy, theoretically the spiritual heart of Western Christianity, often resembled a deeply dysfunctional royal court trapped inside a crumbling city. And yet, strangely enough, the institution survived. That may be the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. Because the medieval church endured not due to stability, but despite spectacular instability. Generation after generation watched corruption, violence and absurdity unfold within Rome, yet the institution continued onward with almost unfathomable persistence. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to normalize chaos, even chaos involving dead popes on trial. The Cadaver Synod sounds absurd to modern ears because we instinctively separate the sacred from the political. Medieval Europe did not. Religion was politics. Politics was religion. To challenge a pope was to challenge divine legitimacy itself. And because authority rested so heavily on sacred symbolism, controlling the image of previous rulers mattered enormously. Formosus could not simply remain buried. His memory had to be publicly destroyed. The trial was theatre, dark, grotesque theatre, a message to rivals that power extended beyond death itself, and yet the plan failed completely. Instead of humiliating Formosus, the spectacle damaged Stephen VI irreparably. The public saw not strength, but instability, not justice, but vengeance. There is something strangely timeless about this. Throughout history, leaders who become obsessed with humiliating enemies often reveal their own insecurity more than their dominance, and medieval Rome specialized in insecurity. Beneath all the politics lies a quieter and more human sadness. Imagine Formosus himself, an aging bishop who spent decades navigating dangerous political waters, trying to survive alliances and betrayals in a collapsing world. Perhaps ambitious, perhaps flawed, almost certainly stubborn, and then imagine his final humiliation, dragged from the grave months after death, displayed before crowds, accused while unable to answer, reduced from holy leader to political prop. There is something deeply melancholic about it, a reminder that power rarely grants dignity in the end. The medieval world often treated the dead not as individuals, but as symbols to be weaponized. Even burial could not guarantee peace, and somewhere in Rome, ordinary citizens watched all this unfold while simply trying to survive daily life, baking bread, hauling water, avoiding disease, praying the next political crisis would not spill into their neighborhood. History often remembers kings and popes, but most people living through these events were merely exhausted spectators. Eventually, the strange scandal of the Cadaver Synod faded into legend. Centuries passed. The ruined churches were repaired. New popes came and went. Rome transformed again and again, yet the image remains unforgettable. A dim basilica, a furious pope, a rotting corpse in ceremonial robes, and frightened witnesses staring at a spectacle so bizarre it almost feels invented. But it happened. Because history is not always grand or noble. Sometimes it is grimy and irrational and deeply human. Sometimes institutions meant to embody eternal truth become consumed by petty revenge. And sometimes, in a cold Roman winter, a dead man is placed on trial because the living cannot let go of their hatred. The candles burn low inside the basilica. The crowd disperses slowly into the damp Roman night, and somewhere beyond the dark waters of the Tiber, the city settles uneasily into silence once more.